Number 1. Richard Ramirez. The Night Stalker's compulsion. Richard Ramirez, known as the Night Stalker, terrorized Southern California during a 14-month reign of terror that stretched from June 1984 to August 1985, leaving behind a trail of death, sexual assault, and psychological devastation that would fundamentally alter how Americans viewed home security and random violence. What distinguished Ramirez from many serial killers was not merely the brutality of his crimes or his seeming randomness in victim selection, but his documented pattern of returning to crime scenes, a behavior that ultimately contributed crucial evidence to his identification and capture. Born Ricardo Leyva Muñoz Ramirez on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, Richard grew up in a troubled household marked by his father's violent temper and his own exposure to graphic violence through his cousin Miguel, a Vietnam War veteran who showed the young Richard photographs of torture and murder from the war, including images of women he had raped and killed. This early exposure to sadistic violence, combined with severe head injuries sustained during childhood epileptic seizures and a developing drug addiction, created a psychological profile that would later fascinate criminal psychologists studying the development of serial predators. By his early 20s, Ramirez had drifted to California, supporting himself through petty theft and burglary while developing an increasingly dark fascination with Satanism, heavy metal music, and violent pornography. His transformation from burglar to killer occurred almost imperceptibly, with his first confirmed murder taking place on June 28, 1984, when he brutally stabbed 79-year-old Jenny Vin Cao in her Los Angeles apartment, nearly decapitating her in a frenzy of violence that shocked even seasoned homicide detectives. What followed was a spree of seemingly random attacks across Los Angeles, Orange County, and the San Francisco Bay Area, with Ramirez breaking into homes in the dead of night, often through unlocked windows or doors, to rape, torture, and murder his victims with whatever weapons were available, from guns to knives to tire irons. The randomness of his victim selection, spanning different ages, ethnicities, and neighborhoods, created widespread panic and earned him his notorious nickname from the media. However, investigators began noticing a peculiar pattern. Ramirez was returning to certain crime scenes, sometimes within days of the initial attack. On March 17, 1985, Ramirez attacked Maria Hernandez and Dale Okazaki in Rosemead, shooting both women, with Okazaki dying at the scene. Investigators discovered that Ramirez had returned to the area multiple times in the following days, apparently driven by some compulsion to revisit the location of his violence. Similarly, after attacking sisters Christina and Mary Caldwell in their San Pablo home, neighbors reported seeing a suspicious man matching Ramirez's description loitering near the house on multiple occasions in the subsequent weeks. This pattern became more pronounced as his spree continued. After the brutal attack on 61-year-old Joyce Lucille Nelson in her Monterey Park home on July 7, 1985, where he beat her to death with a tire iron, residents reported seeing a tall, thin man with dark curly hair and rotting teeth walking slowly past the house on at least 3 separate occasions. The psychological motivation behind this compulsion has been extensively analyzed by criminal profilers, who suggest that Ramirez was likely reliving his crimes, seeking to recapture the sense of power and control he experienced during the attacks, or possibly searching for souvenirs he may have overlooked during his initial intrusions. What Ramirez didn't realize was that these returns were providing investigators with crucial opportunities to gather evidence and witness descriptions. On the night of August 24, 1985, Ramirez broke into the Mission Viejo home of Bill Carnes and his fiancée Inez Erickson, shooting Carnes 3 times in the head and sexually assaulting Erickson before fleeing in the couple's car. Miraculously, Carnes survived, and Erickson provided investigators with a detailed description of their attacker. The abandoned car yielded a single fingerprint that, when processed through the newly implemented automated fingerprint identification system, matched Richard Ramirez, who had previous arrests for drug possession and burglary. As police began surveillance operations and released Ramirez's photograph to the media, Witnesses came forward with reports of having seen him returning to previous crime scenes, information that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now formed a crucial part of the investigative timeline. The media saturation with Ramirez's photograph proved to be his downfall. On August 31, 1985, while attempting to steal a car in East Los Angeles, he was recognized by residents who chased him down and held him until police arrived. Throughout his capture, Ramirez shouted about being the Night Stalker, seeming to relish the notoriety his crimes had generated. His trial, which began in 1988, became a media spectacle, with Ramirez displaying a pentagram on his palm and shouting "Hail Satan" in court, playing into the satanic panic that gripped America during the 1980s. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence linking Ramirez to 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries, including testimony from multiple witnesses who had seen him returning to crime scenes. The defense attempted to argue that the eyewitness identifications were unreliable and that the fingerprint evidence had been contaminated, but the sheer volume of forensic evidence, combined with survivor testimony, proved insurmountable. On September 20, 1989, after a trial that lasted over a year, the jury found Ramirez guilty on all 43 counts, including 13 counts of murder, and recommended the death penalty. During the penalty phase, Ramirez remained defiant, telling the court, "You don't understand me. You are not expected to. You are not capable of it. I am beyond your experience. I am beyond good and evil." He was formally sentenced to death on November 7, 1989, joining the hundreds of inmates on California's death row at San Quentin State Prison. His behavior on death row continued to generate controversy, as he married magazine editor Doreen Leoe in 1996 in a ceremony at San Quentin, received numerous letters from admirers fascinated by his crimes, and gave occasional interviews in which he showed no remorse for his victims, instead discussing his belief in Satanism and his contempt for society's moral standards. The question of why Ramirez returned to his crime scenes has been extensively debated by criminal psychologists, with theories ranging from paraphilic arousal patterns where he was sexually stimulated by revisiting locations of his violence, to cognitive mapping behaviors where he was ensuring he hadn't left evidence behind, to simple narcissistic gratification from seeing the aftermath of his crimes and the fear he had instilled in communities. Dr. Michael Stone, a forensic psychiatrist who studied the case, suggested that Ramirez exhibited characteristics of both organized and disorganized serial killers, with his returns to crime scenes representing the organized aspect of his personality asserting control over what were often chaotic, frenzied attacks driven by drug use and impulsive violence. On June 7, 2013, after 23 years on death row and numerous appeals that had exhausted California's legal system, Richard Ramirez died from complications related to B-cell lymphoma at Marin General Hospital, never having faced execution for his crimes, a fact that generated significant controversy and renewed debates about the effectiveness of California's death penalty system. His death brought a measure of closure to survivors and victims' families, though many expressed frustration that he had died of natural causes rather than facing execution for his crimes. The Night Stalker case fundamentally changed home security practices across Southern California, with sales of deadbolts, window locks, and alarm systems surging in the wake of his attacks, and his pattern of returning to crime scenes has since been studied extensively in criminal justice programs as an example of how even highly chaotic offenders can exhibit behavioral patterns that, when recognized, provide crucial investigative leads. The case also highlighted the importance of emerging technologies in law enforcement, as the automated fingerprint identification system that identified Ramirez had only recently been implemented and proved instrumental in solving what had been a seemingly impossible case. Today, the Ramirez case remains a touchstone in discussions of serial murder, satanic panic in American culture, and the psychological compulsions that drive certain offenders to revisit the scenes of their crimes, seeking something that even they may not fully understand. Number 2. Dennis Rader. BTK's decades of surveillance. Dennis Lynn Rader lived an outwardly unremarkable life in Park City, Kansas, as a married father of two, a Boy Scout leader, a compliance officer for the local government, and a president of his church congregation. Yet for 31 years he harbored one of the darkest secrets in American criminal history. He was BTK, the serial killer who had terrorized Wichita with a series of brutal murders between 1974 and 1991, and who had compulsively returned to his crime scenes and the homes of his victims long after the murders were committed, driven by a need to relive his crimes and maintain psychological connection to his victims. Born on March 9, 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas, Rader grew up in a working-class family and exhibited disturbing behaviors from childhood, including torturing animals and developing elaborate fantasies about binding, torturing, and killing women, fantasies that would eventually give him his self-chosen nickname, BTK, standing for Bind, Torture, Kill. After serving in the United States Air Force from 1966 to 1970, Rader returned to Kansas, married his wife Paula in 1971, and settled into what appeared to be a conventional middle-class existence while secretly nurturing increasingly violent sexual fantasies that he meticulously documented in drawings and writings. His first known murders occurred on January 15, 1974, when he broke into the home of the Otero family in Wichita, systematically killing Joseph Otero, his wife Julie, and two of their children, 11-year-old Josephine and 9-year-old Joseph Jr., in a carefully planned attack that he had rehearsed mentally for months. Rader later described in chilling detail how he had cut the phone lines, surprised the family, and spent hours in the house binding and strangling each victim, masturbating over Josephine's body after hanging her in the basement, demonstrating the sexual motivation that drove his killings. What distinguished Rader from many serial killers was his compulsive need to return to crime scenes, a pattern that began immediately after the Otero murders and continued throughout his criminal career. Neighbors reported seeing a suspicious man driving slowly past the Otero home numerous times in the weeks and months following the murders, observations that seemed unremarkable at the time but later proved significant when investigators reconstructed Rader's movements. In April 1974, 3 months after the Otero murders, Rader killed Catherine Bright in her home, stabbing her 11 times while her brother Kevin fought desperately to save her, managing to escape despite being shot twice by Rader, providing police with the first description of the BTK killer. Once again, Rader returned to the crime scene multiple times, later admitting that he drove past Catherine Bright's house regularly, sometimes parking nearby to watch the house and relive the attack in his mind. This pattern escalated with subsequent murders. After strangling Shirley Vian in her home on March 17, 1977, while her 3 young children were locked in the bathroom, Rader returned to the neighborhood repeatedly, photographing the house and even approaching neighbors under various pretexts to discuss the murder and observe the ongoing impact on the community. On December 8, 1977, Rader killed Nancy Fox in her home, strangling her with a belt after binding her hands and feet, then calling police from a phone booth to report the murder in a calm, matter-of-fact voice that chilled investigators. In the following months and years, Rader drove past Nancy Fox's house hundreds of times, documented these visits in his secret journals, and even knocked on the door of her former residence years later, speaking with the new occupants about the murder under the guise of being a concerned community member. The psychological compulsion that drove Rader to return to crime scenes became even more pronounced during the long hiatus in his killing spree between 1991 and his eventual capture in 2005. During these years, when he wasn't actively killing, Rader channeled his compulsions into elaborate surveillance activities, regularly driving past the homes of former victims, photographing the residences, and maintaining detailed records of changes to the properties and neighborhoods. He attended memorial services for some victims, inserting himself into the ongoing grief of families and communities, deriving satisfaction from being present while his identity remained unknown. In several instances, Rader engaged victims' family members in conversation about the murders, asking questions about the investigations and offering sympathy, a behavior that allowed him to gauge the emotional impact of his crimes while maintaining his facade as a concerned citizen. This need for connection to his crimes extended beyond physical returns to crime scenes. Rader sent numerous communications to media outlets and police, including letters, packages containing items taken from victims, and elaborate puzzles that referenced his murders, all designed to maintain his psychological connection to his crimes and assert his power over the investigation. The break in the case came through this very compulsion to communicate. After a 31-year career marked by periods of intense activity and long dormancy, Rader emerged from his silence in March 2004, sending a letter to the Wichita Eagle newspaper taking credit for an unsolved 1986 murder. This resumption of communication led to a series of letters, packages, and messages over the following year, with Rader becoming increasingly bold and making mistakes he would never have made during his active killing period. In January 2005, Rader sent a package to a television station containing a purple floppy disk, believing police assurances that such a disk could not be traced back to him. Forensic examination of the disk revealed metadata showing it had been used at Christ Lutheran Church and was last modified by someone named Dennis. Information that, combined with Rader's established pattern of returning to crime scenes and inserting himself into investigations, led detectives directly to Dennis Rader. On February 25, 2005, police arrested Rader near his home, and during interrogation, he confessed in meticulous detail to all 10 murders, describing his returns to crime scenes as essential to his ability to relive and maintain control over his victims even years after their deaths. Rader explained that he kept detailed records of these visits, including photographs, maps, and written descriptions, which he used for masturbatory fantasies when he wasn't actively killing, revealing the deeply paraphilic nature of his compulsion to return to crime scenes. The investigation that followed his arrest uncovered a horrifying archive in his home. Thousands of photographs of crime scenes and victims' homes, detailed journals documenting his surveillance activities, crude drawings depicting his murders and fantasies, and numerous items taken from victims' homes that he had kept as trophies. Perhaps most disturbing were his practice materials. Photographs of himself in bondage poses wearing victims' clothing, elaborate plans for future murders that he had never carried out, and detailed records of women he had surveilled for potential future attacks, women who never knew how close they had come to becoming his victims. At his trial, which began in June 2005, Rader pleaded guilty to all 10 counts of first-degree murder, and during his allocution, he provided chilling, emotionless descriptions of each killing, referring to his victims as projects and describing his returns to crime scenes as necessary to maintain what he called his Factor X, his term for the sexual compulsion that drove his crimes. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including DNA matches, items taken from victims, and Rader's own detailed confessions, while the defense offered no mitigation, as Kansas law did not allow the death penalty for murders committed before 1994, meaning Rader faced mandatory life imprisonment. On August 18, 2005, Judge Gregory Waller sentenced Rader to 10 consecutive life sentences with a minimum of 175 years before eligibility for parole, ensuring he would die in prison. Rader showed no emotion at sentencing, even as victims' family members delivered impact statements describing the decades of pain and fear his crimes had caused. In prison, Rader has given numerous interviews to criminologists and journalists, describing in disturbing detail his compulsion to return to crime scenes and explaining that these returns were essential to his psychological satisfaction, as they allowed him to reassert control and dominance over his victims and maintain the fantasy that they were still his possessions. Dr. Catherine Ramsland, who conducted extensive interviews with Rader for her book Confession of a Serial Killer, documented his explanation that returning to crime scenes provided him with a form of psychological nourishment, allowing him to extend the pleasure of his crimes indefinitely and maintain his secret double life by creating a feedback loop between his public persona and his hidden identity. The BTK case has become a seminal study in criminal psychology, particularly regarding the phenomenon of offenders who return to crime scenes, with researchers identifying Rader's behavior as an extreme example of what criminologists call post-offense conduct, driven by paraphilic disorders and narcissistic personality traits. His meticulous documentation of his returns to crime scenes provided unprecedented insight into the psychological motivations behind this behavior, revealing that for Rader, the murders themselves were only part of a larger cycle of fantasy, action, and reliving that could extend for years or even decades. The case also highlighted the dangers of long-dormant serial offenders, as Rader's 31-year career demonstrated that such individuals can successfully maintain double lives for extraordinary periods, integrated into their communities and trusted by those around them while harboring monstrous secrets. Today, Rader remains in the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he continues to maintain his innocuous exterior while corresponding with researchers and occasionally granting interviews in which he discusses his crimes with the same detached, bureaucratic precision he brought to his work as a compliance officer, a chilling reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most ordinary and integrated into everyday life. Number 3. Joel Rifkin, the Long Island serial killer's morbid curiosity. Joel David Rifkin grew up in East Meadow, New York, a socially awkward, bullied child who would become one of the most prolific serial killers in New York history, murdering 17 women between 1989 and 1993, primarily sex workers who vanished from the streets of New York City with little initial investigation or media attention, a fact that allowed Rifkin to continue killing for 4 years while simultaneously developing an obsessive pattern of returning to the disposal sites where he had dumped his victims' bodies, driven by what he later described as a need to ensure the bodies remained undiscovered and a morbid curiosity about the decomposition process. Born on January 20, 1959, to unwed college students who gave him up for adoption, Rifkin was adopted by Bernard and Jean Rifkin 3 weeks after birth and raised in a middle-class Jewish household alongside his adopted sister. Despite his parents' efforts to provide a stable, loving environment, Rifkin struggled profoundly throughout his childhood and adolescence, suffering from severe dyslexia that went undiagnosed for years, leading to academic failures and relentless bullying from classmates who mocked his learning difficulties and social awkwardness. His isolation intensified during high school at East Meadow High School, where he was voted most likely to be forgotten by his classmates, a cruel designation that reflected his invisibility within the social hierarchy and contributed to his developing rage toward society and particularly toward women. After barely graduating high school, Rifkin attended several colleges but never completed a degree, dropping out of Nassau Community College, then the State University of New York at Brockport, and finally the State University of New York at Farmingdale, each time unable to connect with peers or succeed academically despite possessing above-average intelligence. By his late 20s, Rifkin was living with his elderly mother in East Meadow, unemployed except for occasional landscaping work, spending his days consuming violent pornography and developing elaborate fantasies about dominating and killing women, particularly sex workers, whom he viewed with a mixture of fascination and contempt. His transformation from fantasy to action occurred in February 1989, when he picked up a sex worker in Manhattan's East Village, brought her back to his mother's house while she was away, and strangled her during sex, experiencing what he later described as an overwhelming sense of power and sexual release that would drive him to kill again and again over the next 4 years. After that first murder, Rifkin dismembered the woman's body in his mother's garage, placed the parts in oil drums, and drove around for several days before disposing of them in various locations across New York and New Jersey, establishing a pattern that would characterize his subsequent murders. What distinguished Rifkin's criminal behavior was his compulsive need to return to the disposal sites where he had left his victims' remains, a pattern that began almost immediately after his first murder and continued throughout his killing spree. Rifkin later told investigators that he would drive to these locations, sometimes within days of disposing of a body, to check whether the remains had been discovered, to observe the decomposition process if the body was still visible, and to relive the sense of power he had experienced during the murder. This compulsion became so strong that Rifkin maintained detailed mental maps of every disposal location, regularly incorporating visits to these sites into his daily routines, driving past them on his way to landscaping jobs or deliberately taking long routes to check on multiple sites in a single trip. On several occasions, Rifkin arrived at disposal sites to find police already there. Having discovered the remains, and rather than fleeing, he would park at a distance and watch the investigation unfold, later describing the experience as sexually arousing because it allowed him to witness the impact of his crimes while remaining anonymous and in control. Between 1989 and 1993, Rifkin murdered at least 17 women, though he hinted that the actual number might be higher, targeting sex workers and drug-addicted women from Manhattan's Lower East Side, the area around Penn Station, and various locations in Queens and Brooklyn. Women whose disappearances often went unreported because of their transient lifestyles and estrangement from family. Rifkin's method was consistent. He would pick up a sex worker, bring her to his mother's house or occasionally to his truck, strangle her manually or with a ligature during or after sex, then dispose of the body in waterways, wooded areas, or remote locations throughout the New York metropolitan area. The bodies began surfacing in 1989, with remains found in the East River, Harlem River, and Hudson River, but investigators initially didn't connect the murders because the bodies were often badly decomposed and scattered across different jurisdictions. Rifkin's returns to disposal sites became more elaborate and risky as his killing spree continued. He began taking photographs of disposal locations, documenting changes over time as seasons shifted and vegetation grew over the sites where he had left bodies. In several instances, Rifkin returned to sites where bodies had already been discovered and removed, later explaining that he experienced a perverse sense of satisfaction from visiting these cleaned locations and knowing that only he understood their significance. The psychological motivation behind these returns was complex, involving elements of trophy collection behavior, monitoring for police activity, sexual arousal from reliving the crimes, and what Rifkin described as a proprietary feeling toward the disposal sites, as if they were his secret spaces that connected him to his victims even after death. This compulsion nearly led to his capture on multiple occasions. In 1992, Rifkin visited a site in New Jersey where he had disposed of body parts and encountered a couple hiking who later reported seeing a suspicious man near the location, leading to increased police presence that Rifkin somehow avoided. Similarly, in early 1993, Rifkin returned to a disposal site in the Bronx and had to flee when he noticed police cars approaching, an incident that should have deterred him but instead seemed to intensify his compulsion, as he returned to the same location less than a week later. Rifkin's capture finally came on June 28, 1993, when state troopers attempted to pull him over for driving without a license plate on the Southern State Parkway on Long Island, leading to a high-speed chase that ended when Rifkin crashed into a utility pole in Mineola. When troopers approached the vehicle, they immediately smelled decomposition and discovered the body of Tiffany Bresciani, Rifkin's 17th and final victim, wrapped in tarp in the back of his truck. During interrogation, Rifkin confessed not only to 17 murders but also provided detailed information about his pattern of returning to disposal sites, leading investigators on a grim tour of locations throughout the metropolitan area where he had left victims' remains. His confessions revealed that he had visited some disposal sites dozens of times over the years, maintaining a twisted form of connection to his victims through these morbid pilgrimages. The subsequent investigation uncovered remains at several locations Rifkin identified, confirming many of his victims' identities through dental records and personal effects he had kept as trophies, while other sites yielded no evidence, either because remains had been completely destroyed by decomposition and scavengers, or because Rifkin's memories of the locations were imprecise after years of returns and revisits had blurred the details. Rifkin's trial began in 1994, with prosecutors presenting overwhelming evidence including his detailed confessions, physical evidence from his mother's home where forensic teams found blood evidence from multiple victims, and testimony from forensic experts about the remains recovered from disposal sites. The defense attempted to argue that Rifkin suffered from mental illness and childhood trauma that diminished his capacity, presenting evidence of his severe dyslexia, social isolation, and documented neurological issues. But the prosecution successfully demonstrated that Rifkin's careful planning, his efforts to avoid detection, and his sophisticated understanding of forensic evidence showed clear consciousness of wrongdoing and capacity for legal responsibility. On May 9, 1994, Rifkin was convicted of 9 counts of second-degree murder. Prosecutors chose to try him initially for 9 murders for which they had the strongest evidence, and sentenced to 203 years to life in prison, with the judge specifically noting Rifkin's pattern of returning to crime scenes as evidence of his ongoing danger to society and his lack of remorse. In subsequent years, Rifkin pleaded guilty to additional murders, ultimately being convicted of a total of 17 murders, though law enforcement officials believe he may have killed more than 20 women, with several cases remaining unsolved or bodies never recovered. In prison at the Clinton Correctional Facility in New York, Rifkin has given extensive interviews to criminal psychologists and criminologists, providing unprecedented detail about his compulsion to return to disposal sites and explaining that these returns served multiple functions. They allowed him to relive the murders and maintain psychological connection to his victims. They satisfied his need to control the narrative by ensuring bodies remained undiscovered or monitoring police investigations when they were discovered, and they provided a form of ritual that structured his life between murders during periods when he was not actively killing. Dr. Louis Schlesinger, a prominent forensic psychologist who studied the case, identified Rifkin's behavior as an extreme example of what criminologists call post-homicidal behavior, and noted that his detailed descriptions of returning to disposal sites provided valuable insights into the psychological needs that drive such behavior in serial murderers. Rifkin's case also highlighted systemic failures in how society and law enforcement respond to crimes against marginalized populations, as most of his victims were sex workers whose disappearances were not actively investigated, allowing Rifkin to kill with relative impunity for 4 years despite disposing of bodies in public waterways and parks. The investigation following Rifkin's arrest led to significant changes in how New York law enforcement handles cases involving missing sex workers and marginalized individuals, with new protocols emphasizing that all disappearances deserve serious investigation regardless of the victim's lifestyle or background. Today, Joel Rifkin remains in prison, where at 65 years old he continues to maintain that his compulsion to return to disposal sites was as powerful and uncontrollable as his compulsion to kill, describing it as an essential part of his identity as a serial murderer and something he would certainly do again if given the opportunity. A chilling reminder of the persistent nature of certain paraphilic disorders and the importance of keeping such individuals permanently separated from society. Number 4. Russell Williams. The Colonel's photographic returns. Colonel Russell Williams represented the pinnacle of military achievement in Canada, serving as the commander of Canadian Forces Base Trenton, the country's largest Air Force base, trusted with flying government officials including Queen Elizabeth II and commanding thousands of military personnel. Yet beneath this exemplary exterior lurked a serial predator who not only committed numerous break-ins, sexual assaults, and 2 murders, but who compulsively returned to the homes of his victims to photograph himself wearing their stolen lingerie and to relive his crimes through elaborate documentation that would ultimately prove instrumental in his capture and conviction. Born David Russell Williams on March 7, 1963, in Bromsgrove, Worcestershire, England, Williams moved with his family to Canada during childhood and grew up in a seemingly stable, upper-middle-class household that valued education and achievement. He excelled academically and attended the University of Toronto, where he earned undergraduate and graduate degrees in economics and political science before joining the Canadian Forces in 1987, beginning a military career marked by consistent advancement, exemplary performance reviews, and growing responsibility within the Royal Canadian Air Force. By all outward measures, Williams was the model officer. Disciplined, intelligent, meticulous in his duties, and respected by subordinates and superiors alike. Married to Mary Elizabeth Harriman, a successful executive, and living in a beautiful home in the upscale Ottawa suburb of Westboro, while maintaining a cottage in the village of Tweed, Ontario. However, beginning in his late 30s, Williams developed an escalating pattern of paraphilic behavior that started with breaking into homes to steal women's underwear and gradually progressed to more serious crimes. His first known break-ins occurred in 2007, when he began entering homes in neighborhoods near his cottage in Tweed, initially just stealing lingerie and taking photographs of himself wearing the stolen items, a behavior that satisfied his sexual compulsions for a time but soon proved insufficient. What distinguished Williams from many sexual offenders was his extraordinary compulsion to document his crimes and to return to the scenes of his offenses, behaviors that reflected his military training in attention to detail and systematic record-keeping but channeled into deeply disturbing purposes. Between 2007 and early 2010, Williams broke into at least 82 homes, stealing thousands of pieces of women's and girls' lingerie, photographing himself wearing these items in the victims' homes, and meticulously cataloging his collection with photographs and computer records that included details about each victim and each break-in. His pattern involved careful surveillance of target homes, often watching women and girls over extended periods to learn their schedules, then breaking in when he knew they would be absent, spending hours in their homes trying on their intimate apparel, masturbating, and taking hundreds of photographs of himself in their bedrooms, bathrooms, and living spaces. The compulsion to return to these crime scenes became increasingly pronounced. Williams would break into the same homes multiple times, sometimes within days or weeks of previous intrusions, adding new photographs to his collection and escalating his behavior by leaving evidence of his presence, such as rearranging items or leaving notes, as if asserting his dominance over the victim's private spaces. In September 2009, Williams's crimes escalated dramatically when he broke into the home of a woman near his cottage, sexually assaulted her while she slept, and photographed the entire assault, marking his transition from property crimes to violent sexual offenses. Just 2 weeks later, Williams broke into another home and committed a second sexual assault, again photographing the crime in meticulous detail and keeping the photographs as part of his growing collection. The compulsion to return to these assault locations became even more pronounced than his returns to burglary sites. Williams drove past the homes of his sexual assault victims dozens of times in the following months, photographed the exteriors repeatedly, and on several occasions parked nearby for extended periods, apparently reliving the assaults or planning future attacks. On November 24, 2009, Williams escalated to murder when he broke into the home of Corporal Marie-France Comeau, a 38-year-old Air Force flight attendant who served under his command at CFB Trenton. Williams waited for hours in her home for her to return from work, then attacked her, bound her with duct tape, sexually assaulted her while photographing the attack, and ultimately suffocated her with duct tape wrapped around her head. After killing Comeau, Williams spent hours in her home, continuing to photograph her body and himself with the body, stealing items of her lingerie, and meticulously cleaning the scene before leaving. In the following weeks, Williams returned to the area near Comeau's home on at least 8 separate occasions, driving past the house, photographing it from various angles, and on one occasion parking across the street and watching as investigators processed the crime scene, later telling interrogators that observing the police investigation gave him a sense of power and sexual excitement. On January 28, 2010, Williams committed his second and final murder, breaking into the home of 27-year-old Jessica Lloyd in Belleville, Ontario, abducting her at gunpoint, and bringing her to his cottage where he held her captive for approximately 24 hours, repeatedly sexually assaulting her while taking hundreds of photographs and videos before beating her to death with a flashlight. Williams then dismembered Lloyd's body and disposed of it in a wooded area near his cottage, but not before taking extensive photographs of the dismemberment process and the disposal site, adding these images to his horrifying collection. In the days following Lloyd's murder, Williams returned to the disposal site at least 6 times, photographing the location from different angles, checking on the concealment of the remains, and on one occasion apparently masturbating at the site while reviewing photographs of the murder on his camera. The investigation into Jessica Lloyd's disappearance focused on the area around Williams's cottage, as she had been abducted from a home just miles away, leading police to conduct roadside checks and interview local residents. On February 4, 2010, Detective Sergeant Jim Smith of the Ontario Provincial Police interviewed Williams as part of routine inquiries, noting his military bearing and cooperation but also observing his unusual interest in the details of the investigation and his nervous body language when discussing his whereabouts on the night of Lloyd's disappearance. Analysis of tire tracks found near Lloyd's home and at the disposal site matched the pattern of tires used on Williams's Nissan Pathfinder, giving investigators probable cause to obtain a search warrant for his cottage and vehicles. On February 7, 2010, police executed search warrants at Williams's cottage and Ottawa residence, discovering his vast collection of photographs documenting his crimes, including thousands of images of him wearing stolen lingerie, photographs of his sexual assaults, and the horrifying documentation of the Comeau and Lloyd murders. The photographic evidence included numerous images of Williams at or near crime scenes taken long after the crimes were committed, providing irrefutable proof of his compulsion to return to these locations. Confronted with this evidence during a legendary 9-hour interrogation conducted by Detective Smith, Williams initially denied involvement but gradually confessed in meticulous detail to all of his crimes, explaining his pattern of returning to crime scenes as necessary to relive the excitement and maintain his sense of control and power over his victims. His confession revealed the extraordinary extent of his documentation. He had created elaborate computer folders organizing photographs by victim, date, and type of crime, maintained spreadsheets tracking his break-ins, and even rated different crimes and different victims according to the level of sexual satisfaction they provided, demonstrating a level of systematic depravity that shocked even experienced investigators. Williams's trial began in October 2010, but lasted only days as he pleaded guilty to all 88 charges, including 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of sexual assault, and 82 counts of break-and-enter. The Crown presented a selection of the photographic evidence during the sentencing hearing, carefully edited to protect victims' privacy, but sufficiently detailed to demonstrate the horrifying scope of Williams's crimes and his compulsive need to document and revisit them. Victim impact statements from sexual assault survivors and family members of the murder victims described the profound trauma caused not only by the crimes themselves but by the knowledge that Williams had photographed them and kept these images as part of his collection, violating them again and again each time he reviewed the photographs. On October 22, 2010, Justice Robert Scott sentenced Williams to 2 concurrent life sentences with no possibility of parole for 25 years for the murders, plus an additional 120 years for the sexual assaults and break-ins, declaring that Williams represented an absolutely reprehensible and horrifying offender who had betrayed the trust placed in him by the Canadian forces and by Canadian society. The military stripped Williams of his rank and decorations in an unprecedented ceremony at which his uniform and medals were burned, symbolically erasing his military achievements in light of his monstrous crimes. The psychological analysis of Williams's case has focused extensively on his compulsive documentation and his pattern of returning to crime scenes, with experts noting that his military training in systematic record-keeping and attention to detail had become perverted into service of his paraphilic disorders, creating what Dr. Michael Cito, a forensic psychologist who studied the case, described as a perfect storm of meticulous organization applied to extreme sexual sadism and narcissism. The photographs Williams took during his returns to crime scenes revealed telling details. He often posed in ways that mimicked his earlier poses when committing the crimes, suggesting he was attempting to recreate the psychological state he had experienced during the offenses, and many photographs showed him displaying objects stolen from victims, indicating that these returns were part of a larger pattern of trophy collection and reliving behavior. The case also raised profound questions about how someone could maintain such a severe double life, fulfilling demanding military responsibilities while simultaneously conducting an extensive campaign of sexual offenses, with investigators concluding that Williams's military discipline actually enabled his crimes by allowing him to compartmentalize his behavior and maintain perfect control over his secret activities. Today, Williams is incarcerated at Port Cartier Institution in Quebec, a maximum security federal prison, where he has reportedly been assaulted by other inmates and remains in protective custody. His ex-wife Mary Elizabeth Harriman divorced him and has maintained complete silence about the case, settling lawsuits with victims and attempting to rebuild her life after the devastating revelation of her husband's crimes. The Williams case has become a central study in criminal psychology programs worldwide, particularly regarding the phenomenon of high-functioning offenders who compulsively document their crimes and return to crime scenes, providing unprecedented insight into how such individuals derive continued satisfaction from their offenses long after the acts themselves are completed, and demonstrating that even the most outwardly successful and trusted individuals can harbor unimaginable darkness beneath carefully maintained facades. Number 5. Ted Bundy, the necrophiliac's pilgrimages. Theodore Robert Bundy represents perhaps the most infamous serial killer in American history, a charming, intelligent law student who murdered at least 30 young women across 7 states between 1974 and 1978, but who distinguished himself not merely through the brutality and scope of his crimes, but through his documented pattern of returning to the remote disposal sites where he had left his victims' bodies, sometimes for weeks or even months after the murders, to engage in necrophilic acts and to relive his crimes through interaction with the decomposing remains, a behavior that provided crucial evidence in his eventual capture and prosecution while revealing the extraordinary depths of his paraphilic disorders. Born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, to Eleanor Louise Cowell, an unwed 22-year-old woman, Bundy spent his early childhood believing his mother was his sister and his grandparents were his parents, a deception designed to shield the family from the stigma of illegitimacy, but one that created profound identity confusion for the young Theodore. In 1951, Eleanor moved with Ted to Tacoma, Washington, where she married Johnny Culpepper Bundy, whose surname Ted would take, though he reportedly never formed a close relationship with his stepfather and harbored lifelong questions about his biological father's identity. Despite these early challenges, Bundy appeared to be a bright, engaged child who performed well in school, though teachers and neighbors later recalled that he seemed emotionally detached and had difficulty forming genuine connections with peers. During his teenage years, Bundy became increasingly withdrawn, developing an obsession with violent pornography and engaging in petty theft and voyeuristic behavior, early warning signs of the paraphilic disorders that would later drive his murders. After graduating from high school, Bundy attended the University of Puget Sound briefly before transferring to the University of Washington, where he studied Chinese and met Stephanie Brooks, a sophisticated older student from California who would become the template for most of his later victims. Attractive, middle-class young women with long dark hair parted in the middle. When Brooks ended their relationship in 1968, reportedly because she found Bundy directionless and immature, the rejection devastated him and apparently triggered the crystallization of his violent fantasies into concrete plans, though he would not begin killing until years later after remaking himself into the kind of man Brooks had wanted, earning a degree in psychology, becoming involved in Republican politics, and enrolling in law school. Bundy's first confirmed murder occurred in January 1974, when he broke into the basement apartment of 18-year-old University of Washington student Linda and Healy, bludgeoned her unconscious with a metal rod from her bed frame, and carried her away to an unknown location where he murdered her and disposed of her body. This began a spree of murders that would continue for 4 years across Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and ultimately Florida, with Bundy typically approaching attractive young women in public places, often pretending to be injured or disabled to lower their guard, then abducting them to remote locations where he would rape, torture, and murder them. What distinguished Bundy's crimes was his practice of keeping bodies at remote disposal sites and returning to them repeatedly to engage in necrophilic acts and to apply makeup and wash their hair, treating the decomposing corpses as if they were living women. His most notorious disposal site was Taylor Mountain in Washington, where Bundy left the remains of at least 4 victims in early 1974, returning to the site on multiple occasions over several months to interact with the bodies as they decomposed. Bundy later confessed to investigators that he would return to these sites with makeup, hairbrushes, and clean clothing, spending hours with the decomposing remains, applying cosmetics, positioning the bodies, photographing them, and engaging in sexual acts, describing these returns as allowing him to extend his possession of his victims indefinitely and to relive the murders without the risk associated with killing new victims. The discovery of remains at Taylor Mountain in March 1975, more than a year after Bundy had left them there, marked a crucial break in the investigation, as forensic analysis revealed evidence of post-mortem animal scavenging and human manipulation, suggesting the bodies had been visited and moved multiple times after death. This pattern repeated at disposal sites across multiple states. After murdering victims in Utah, Bundy returned to remote canyon areas to interact with the bodies, in one instance telling investigators he had returned more than 30 times to a particular site where he had left 2 victims. The compulsion to return to bodies became so strong that Bundy took extraordinary risks to do so, in several instances returning to sites where he knew search parties were operating, parking at a distance and hiking in to reach the remains while avoiding detection. On August 16, 1975, Bundy was arrested in Utah after a traffic stop revealed burglary tools in his Volkswagen Beetle, leading to his conviction for aggravated kidnapping in the Carol Duranch case, a victim who had escaped his attempted abduction. While imprisoned in Colorado awaiting trial for murder, Bundy escaped twice, the second time successfully fleeing to Florida where he committed his final murders, including the savage attack on the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University on January 15, 1978, where he bludgeoned and strangled 4 young women, killing 2, and the abduction and murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, whose body he left in an abandoned pig barn where it was discovered weeks later showing evidence of post-mortem manipulation. Following his final capture in Florida, Bundy initially refused to confess to his crimes but eventually, in the years leading up to his execution, provided detailed confessions to investigators from multiple states, seeking to delay his execution by trading information about unsolved cases. These confessions included extensive descriptions of his returns to body disposal sites, with Bundy explaining that this behavior provided him with ongoing sexual gratification and allowed him to maintain a sense of control and possession over his victims even after death, in effect extending each murder into a prolonged experience rather than a single event. Dr. Dorothy Otno-Lewis, a psychiatrist who interviewed Bundy extensively, noted that his descriptions of returning to bodies revealed classic necrophilic paraphilia combined with elements of obsessive compulsive disorder, as Bundy described feeling compelled to return to sites even when he consciously recognized the risk, driven by intrusive thoughts about the bodies and fantasies about interacting with them. The forensic evidence recovered from disposal sites supported Bundy's confessions. Skeletal remains showed evidence of having been moved and repositioned multiple times. Personal items belonging to victims were found scattered around sites suggesting repeated visits and disturbance. And in several cases, footprints and tire tracks were found at sites months after the murders, matching Bundy's shoes and vehicles. Bundy's trial in Florida for the Chi Omega murders became a media sensation, with Bundy representing himself and displaying the charm and intelligence that had allowed him to evade capture for so long. But the physical evidence was overwhelming. Bite marks on one victim matched Bundy's distinctive dental impressions. Eyewitnesses placed him at the scene, and his own behavior during the attacks, including his return to the area shortly after the murders, provided circumstantial evidence of his guilt. On July 24, 1979, the jury found Bundy guilty on all counts, and Judge Edward Cowart sentenced him to death, delivering the famous statement, "Take care of yourself, young man. I say that to you sincerely. Take care of yourself, please." It is an utter tragedy for this court to see such a total waste of humanity as I've experienced in this courtroom. You're a bright young man. You would have made a good lawyer, and I would have loved to have you practice in front of me. But you went another way, partner. Take care of yourself. I don't feel any animosity toward you. I want you to know that. Once again, take care of yourself. Bundy was also convicted of the Kimberly Leach murder and received a second death sentence, exhausting his appeals over the following decade while confessing to additional murders in an attempt to delay execution. In the final days before his execution, Bundy confessed to over 30 murders, though investigators believe the actual number may have been much higher, possibly over 100 victims, and provided detailed information about his returns to disposal sites, describing specific sites where he had returned dozens of times over months or even years to interact with remains. His confessions revealed that his last visit to some disposal sites had occurred just days before his arrest, demonstrating the compulsive nature of this behavior and its central role in his criminal psychopathology. On January 24, 1989, Theodore Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair at Florida State Prison, dying at age 42 after spending a decade on death row. His death witnessed by hundreds of spectators who gathered outside the prison to celebrate, reflecting the intense public hatred his crimes had generated. His final interviews, conducted in the days before execution, included discussions with Dr. James Dobson in which Bundy blamed violent pornography for his crimes, a claim most experts viewed as a final manipulation designed to shift responsibility from himself to external influences. The psychological analysis of Bundy's compulsion to return to disposal sites has provided crucial insights into necrophilic paraphilias and the mechanisms by which serial killers maintain psychological connection to their victims, with researchers noting that Bundy's behavior represents an extreme form of objectification in which victims were reduced to possessions that he could visit and manipulate at will, extending his sense of power and control indefinitely beyond the moment of death. The recovery operations at sites Bundy identified revealed horrifying evidence of his repeated visits. Remains showed signs of having been handled, moved, and manipulated long after death. Personal items were found arranged in patterns suggesting ritualistic behavior, and in some cases investigators found evidence that Bundy had brought supplies with him during returns, including grooming implements, photography equipment, and in one instance a sleeping bag, suggesting he had spent the night at a disposal site with decomposing remains. The Bundy case has become perhaps the most studied in criminal psychology, with his pattern of returning to crime scenes and disposal sites serving as a foundational example of how certain offenders derive continued satisfaction from their crimes through ritualized revisitation and interaction with victims even after death, providing a chilling window into the most extreme forms of paraphilic disorders and the devastating consequences when such pathology goes unrecognized and untreated until it manifests in serial murder. Number 6. Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer's photographic obsession. Rodney James Alcala, known as the dating game killer after his surreal appearance on the television show The Dating Game in the midst of his murder spree, terrorized California and potentially other states for over a decade, killing at least 8 people but likely many more, while compulsively photographing his victims and returning to murder scenes to document the locations and relive his crimes through an elaborate archive of photographs that would eventually help identify additional victims and provide crucial evidence in his prosecution. Born Rodrigo Jacques Alcala Bucher on August 23, 1943, in San Antonio, Texas, Alcala experienced severe childhood trauma when his father abandoned the family, leading his mother to move with Rodney and his siblings to Los Angeles in 1951, where they struggled financially and Alcala reportedly suffered from undiagnosed mental health issues that manifested in increasingly disturbing behavior during adolescence. Despite these challenges, Alcala showed significant intelligence and creativity, developing skills in photography that would later become central to both his criminal activities and his eventual capture. After dropping out of the UCLA School of Fine Arts, Alcala joined the United States Army in 1961, but received a medical discharge in 1963 after suffering what was described as a nervous breakdown, though later analysis suggests he was discharged because superiors recognized concerning psychological issues including antisocial behavior and aggressive tendencies toward women. Following his discharge, Alcala returned to Los Angeles and began working various jobs while developing his photography skills and beginning what would become a lifelong pattern of using his camera to document potential victims and crime locations. His first known attack occurred in 1968, when he lured 8-year-old Tali Shapiro into his Hollywood apartment, brutally beat her with a steel bar, and sexually assaulted her, leaving her for dead before fleeing when a witness reported the attack. Miraculously, Shapiro survived, but Alcala had already fled California, eventually enrolling at New York University under an assumed name and even working as a counselor at a New Hampshire arts camp for children, a chilling position given his predatory nature, before his capture by FBI agents who recognized him from wanted posters in 1971. Due to the surviving victim's young age and her family's reluctance to have her testify, prosecutors accepted a plea deal in which Alcala pleaded guilty to child molestation and received a relatively light sentence, serving just 34 months before being released on parole in 1974. A decision that would prove catastrophically wrong as Alcala immediately resumed his predatory behavior. Within months of his release, Alcala was arrested again for providing marijuana to a 13-year-old girl and violating parole, serving an additional 2 years before being released in 1977, at which point he moved back to California and escalated to murder. Between 1977 and 1979, Alcala killed at least 7 people in California, primarily attractive young women whom he approached in public places, often asking to photograph them for his portfolio, a ploy that allowed him to gain their trust and learn their schedules before attacking them. What distinguished Alcala from other serial killers was his obsessive use of photography both during his crimes and in his compulsive returns to murder scenes, with investigators later discovering hundreds of photographs showing locations where bodies were found, taken from multiple angles and on multiple occasions, suggesting Alcala returned to these sites repeatedly to document them and relive his crimes. His victims during this period included Jill Barkham, an 18-year-old found strangled in the Hollywood Hills in November 1977, Georgia Wickstead, a 27-year-old nurse beaten to death in her Malibu apartment in December 1977, Charlotte Lamb, a 32-year-old legal secretary strangled in her El Segundo apartment in June 1978, Jill Parento, a 21-year-old computer operator killed in her Burbank apartment in June 1979, and 12-year-old Robin Samso, abducted from Huntington Beach in June 1979 and murdered in the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains. The Samso case would prove to be Alcala's undoing. Witnesses reported seeing him photographing Robin and her friend at the beach shortly before Robin's disappearance, and when police showed the witness a photo array, they immediately identified Alcala, who was already in a database due to his prior convictions. When police executed a search warrant on Alcala's Seattle storage locker, where he had recently moved to avoid detection, they discovered a horrifying cache of evidence including hundreds of photographs of women and children, many in vulnerable or sexualized positions, jewelry and personal items belonging to multiple victims, and numerous photographs of remote locations in the mountains and deserts of Southern California, many showing the same locations photographed from different angles and, apparently at different times based on changes in vegetation and lighting. Detailed analysis of these photographs revealed that many corresponded precisely to locations where murder victims had been found or where hikers had reported finding suspicious items, strongly suggesting Alcala had returned to murder sites to photograph them, possibly to relive the crimes or to document his work for future satisfaction. Alcala's first trial for Robin Samso's murder in 1980 resulted in a death sentence, but this conviction was overturned on appeal due to procedural errors, leading to a second trial in 1986 that again resulted in a death sentence, which was also overturned in 2003 due to issues with jury instructions. By the time of his third trial in 2010, DNA technology had advanced sufficiently to link Alcala definitively to 4 additional murders. Jill Barkham, Georgia Wixted, Charlotte Lamb, and Jill Parento, transforming the trial into a massive prosecution covering 5 murders spanning 3 years. The prosecution's case included the photographs found in Alcala's possession, many showing locations where victims were found, with forensic analysts testifying that the photographs had been taken on multiple dates, proving Alcala had returned to these locations repeatedly. The trial also revealed that Alcala had kept a macabre trophy collection including earrings belonging to Robin Samso and other personal items from victims, suggesting his returns to crime scenes were part of a larger pattern of maintaining psychological connection to his victims through both physical souvenirs and photographic documentation. Perhaps most disturbing was evidence that Alcala had photographed some victims while they were alive and then returned to photograph the disposal sites after murdering them, creating a before and after record of his crimes that demonstrated extraordinary callousness and narcissism. The jury heard testimony from a photo analyst who had studied the hundreds of images found in Alcala's possession, identifying numerous photographs that appeared to show remote locations photographed on multiple occasions, with the analyst explaining that the variations in shadows, vegetation, and seasonal markers indicated the photographs were taken months or even years apart, proving Alcala had maintained a long-term practice of revisiting these sites. On February 25, 2010, the jury found Alcala guilty on all 5 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, and on March 30, 2010, he was sentenced to death for the 3rd time, with Judge Francisco Briceño calling him a remorseless killer and noting that his photographic documentation of crime scenes demonstrated a level of narcissism and detachment that made him an ongoing danger even in custody. Following this conviction, authorities in New York charged Alcala with 2 additional murders from the 1970s. The killing of Cornelia Crilly in 1971 and Ellen Jane Hover in 1977, both young women who disappeared from Manhattan under circumstances consistent with Alcala's known methods, with DNA evidence conclusively linking him to both crimes. In 2013, Alcala pleaded guilty to these murders to avoid extradition and trial in New York, receiving an additional sentence of 25 years to life for each killing. In Wyoming, authorities also investigated Alcala in connection with the 1977 disappearance of Christine Thornton, whose remains were identified in 2013 after her photograph was found among the hundreds of images seized from Alcala's storage unit, though he was never formally charged in that case due to his existing death sentences. The question of how many victims Alcala actually claimed remains open. In 2010, Huntington Beach police released 120 photographs from Alcala's collection showing unidentified women and children in various poses, some sexually suggestive, asking the public to help identify potential victims, leading to numerous tips but only a handful of positive identifications, with many of the photographed individuals never identified, leaving the disturbing possibility that some may have been additional victims whose murders remain undiscovered. The psychological analysis of Alcala's compulsion to photograph crime scenes and return to them repeatedly has provided valuable insights into the mechanisms by which certain offenders maintain psychological connection to their crimes, with experts noting that Alcala's behavior combined elements of trophy collection, narcissistic documentation, and paraphilic arousal, with the photographs serving as both masturbatory aids and as proof of his superiority over law enforcement and society. Dr. Park Dietz, a prominent forensic psychiatrist who reviewed the case, noted that Alcala's returns to crime scenes represented an unusual combination of risk-taking behavior and compulsive documentation, suggesting a complex personality structure in which narcissism and paraphilic disorders reinforced each other, driving him to take extraordinary risks to obtain photographic records of his crimes. On July 24, 2021, Rodney Alcala died of natural causes at age 77 in a hospital near Corcoran State Prison, where he had been on death row for over a decade, never having been executed for his crimes and maintaining his innocence despite overwhelming DNA evidence and photographic documentation linking him to multiple murders. His death came before investigators could conclusively determine the full scope of his crimes, with estimates ranging from 8 confirmed victims to potentially dozens more, based on the unidentified individuals in his photograph collection and the gaps in his known whereabouts during the 1970s when he traveled extensively across the United States. The legacy of the Alcala case includes significant advances in how law enforcement handles photographic evidence and uses image databases to identify potential victims, with the release of Alcala's photograph collection representing one of the first large-scale public appeals for victim identification through images, a practice that has since become more common in cases involving predators who document their crimes. Today, the Alcala photographs remain in law enforcement custody, with some images still under analysis as investigators continue attempting to identify individuals and determine whether any additional victims remain undiscovered, representing an ongoing investigation even after the perpetrator's death, and serving as a chilling reminder that some serial killers leave behind mysteries that may never be fully solved, their true victim counts remaining unknown as they carry their secrets to the grave. Number 7. Gary Ridgway, The Green River Killer's Revisitations. Gary Leon Ridgway, known as the Green River Killer after the location where his first victims were found, conducted one of the longest and most prolific serial murder sprees in American history, killing at least 49 women over nearly 2 decades between 1982 and 1998, primarily targeting sex workers and runaways in the Seattle-Tacoma area, while maintaining a compulsive pattern of returning to the dump sites where he had left victims' bodies, sometimes to engage in necrophilic acts, sometimes simply to relive the murders, and sometimes to move bodies to different locations when he feared discovery, a behavior pattern that provided crucial forensic evidence while demonstrating the extraordinary psychological compulsions that drove his crimes. Born on February 18, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah, Ridgway grew up in a working-class family that moved to Washington State during his childhood, where he experienced a deeply troubled relationship with his mother Mary, who was reportedly domineering and abusive, creating in Ridgway a complex mixture of sexual attraction to and hatred for women that would later manifest in his targeting of sex workers, women he could both utilize sexually and punish through murder. Throughout his childhood and adolescence, Ridgway exhibited disturbing behaviors including wetting the bed until his mid-teens, cruelty to animals, and low academic performance that resulted in him being held back and graduating high school at age 20. Experiences that contributed to feelings of inadequacy and rage that he would later channel into violence against women. After a brief stint in the United States Navy from 1969 to 1971, where he served during the Vietnam War era, Ridgway returned to Washington and began working as a truck painter for the Kenworth Truck Company, a job he would hold for over 30 years while simultaneously conducting his murder spree, demonstrating an ability to maintain a facade of normalcy that allowed him to evade detection for nearly 2 decades. Ridgway was married 3 times, with his third wife later expressing shock at discovering his crimes, describing him as a devoted husband who attended church regularly and seemed obsessed with religion and morality, even as he was actively killing women and engaging in necrophilic acts at dump sites. His murders began in earnest in 1982, when bodies started appearing in or near the Green River south of Seattle, primarily young women who worked as prostitutes along the Pacific Highway South Corridor, an area known for street-level sex work. Ridgway's method was consistent. He would pick up sex workers, bring them to his home or to secluded locations, strangle them during or after sex, then transport their bodies to remote dump sites in wooded areas, ravines, or along riverbanks throughout King County. What distinguished Ridgway from many serial killers was his extraordinarily high victim count and his compulsive need to return to dump sites, often for weeks or months after depositing bodies, to engage in sexual acts with the decomposing remains or simply to check on the bodies and ensure they remained undiscovered. Ridgway later confessed that he would return to dump sites dozens of times, having sex with corpses until decomposition made it physically impossible, describing these returns as providing the same satisfaction as the murders themselves while carrying less risk since he wasn't actively killing during these visits. This pattern of revisitation became a crucial element of the investigation. As bodies continued to surface throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, investigators from the Green River Task Force documented patterns in how and when bodies were moved, noting that in several cases remains that had been in one location appeared to have been relocated to different sites, suggesting the killer was returning and moving bodies, either to avoid detection or for psychological reasons. In 1984, Ridgway came to police attention when his name appeared on a list of men who had been seen soliciting sex workers in the Pacific Highway South area, but limited evidence and the overwhelming number of potential suspects meant he was not immediately prioritized for intensive investigation. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, Ridgway continued killing regularly, with bodies appearing at an alarming rate, though the pace of discoveries slowed in the late 1980s not because Ridgway had stopped killing but because he had become more sophisticated in body disposal, choosing more remote locations and taking steps to accelerate decomposition, including placing bodies in water or areas with heavy animal scavenger activity. The investigation consumed massive resources, with the Green River Task Force becoming one of the largest serial killer investigations in American history, interviewing thousands of witnesses and potential suspects while bodies continued to surface, creating enormous pressure on law enforcement and generating fear throughout sex worker communities in the Seattle area. The breakthrough in the case came through advances in DNA technology. In 2001, forensic scientists were able to extract viable DNA from semen samples recovered from several victims in the early 1980s, samples that had been preserved but were too degraded for analysis using earlier technology. And when this DNA was compared to samples from earlier suspects, it matched Gary Ridgway, who had been required to provide a DNA sample after a 1987 arrest for soliciting a sex worker. On November 30, 2001, police arrested Ridgway at his workplace, and during subsequent interrogation, faced with DNA evidence linking him conclusively to multiple victims, he eventually confessed to killing approximately 70 women, though he could provide specific details for only 49 murders, with investigators believing his actual victim count might be higher than even he remembered. During his confessions, which were conducted over several months in 2003 as part of a plea agreement to avoid the death penalty, Ridgway provided extensive detail about his compulsion to return to dump sites, explaining that he would visit bodies regularly, sometimes weekly, until decomposition or scavenger activity made the remains unrecognizable, at which point he would often move the bones to new locations or simply leave them scattered. He described a meticulous mental map of dump site locations throughout the heavily forested areas of King County, leading investigators on recovery missions that uncovered remains at numerous previously unknown sites. Ridgway's descriptions of his returns to dump sites revealed disturbing details. He would bring lubricant with him specifically to facilitate necrophilic acts. He would sometimes position bodies in specific poses before leaving them, and he would occasionally bring items from his daily life, including food or drinks, consuming them at dump sites while in proximity to decomposing remains, demonstrating an extraordinary level of comfort with death and decomposition. The psychological motivations behind Ridgway's compulsive returns to dump sites combined elements of necrophilia, trophy behavior, and what forensic psychologists describe as cognitive ownership, in which he maintained psychological possession of victims by regularly visiting their remains and ensuring he knew their locations. Dr. Mary Ellen O'Toole, a former FBI profiler who studied the case, noted that Ridgway's behavior represented an extreme form of objectification in which victims existed only as vehicles for his sexual gratification, with their deaths not ending his use of them but merely changing the nature of his interactions from live victims to corpses. On November 5, 2003, in a controversial plea agreement designed to locate additional victims and provide closure to families, Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder, agreeing to assist investigators in locating remains in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. The plea agreement generated significant controversy, with many victims' advocates and law enforcement officials arguing that Ridgway deserved execution given the scope and brutality of his crimes, while prosecutors defended the deal as necessary to locate victims and provide answers to families who had waited decades for information about their missing loved ones. At his sentencing hearing, Ridgway faced victims' family members who delivered emotional impact statements, many expressing anger at his survival while their loved ones were dead, while others simply demanded he reveal the locations of all remaining victims. On December 18, 2003, Judge Richard Jones sentenced Ridgway to 48 life sentences without possibility of parole plus 480 years, 1 life sentence for each victim and 10 years for each count of tampering with evidence by moving bodies. In 2011, Ridgway pleaded guilty to his 49th murder when DNA evidence definitively linked him to the death of Rebecca Marrero, receiving an additional life sentence. Throughout his incarceration at Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, Ridgway has occasionally assisted investigators with cold cases, in 2013 helping locate the remains of 2 additional victims whose bodies had not been previously found, demonstrating his extraordinary memory for dump site locations even decades after the fact. His continued cooperation has provided valuable information to investigators and families, though some remains from his confirmed victims have never been recovered, likely due to scavenger activity, environmental changes, or Ridgway's imperfect memory of locations after so many years. The study of Ridgway's pattern of returning to dump sites has contributed significantly to criminal profiling and forensic psychology, with researchers noting that his behavior demonstrated how certain offenders maintain long-term psychological relationships with their victims through ritualized revisitation, treating dump sites as personal spaces where they could relive their crimes and maintain a sense of control and power. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of marginalized populations, particularly sex workers, whose disappearances initially received minimal investigation or media attention, allowing Ridgway to kill with relative impunity for years before law enforcement devoted adequate resources to the investigation. Today, the Green River Killer case remains the second deadliest serial murder case in United States history by confirmed victim count, surpassed only by Samuel Little, and Ridgway's pattern of compulsively returning to crime scenes and dump sites has become a classic case study in criminal psychology courses and law enforcement training programs worldwide, demonstrating how behavioral patterns, when properly analyzed, can provide crucial investigative leads even in cases involving highly prolific offenders operating over extended periods. Number 8. Israel Keyes. The methodical traveler's reconnaissance returns. Israel Keyes represented a new and terrifying evolution in serial murder. A methodical, intelligent predator who planned his crimes years in advance, traveling thousands of miles to kill victims in locations he had no connection to, burying kill kits containing weapons and tools in remote locations across the United States for future use, and compulsively returning to these cache sites and to locations where he had committed or planned crimes, creating an extraordinarily complex web of premeditation and revisitation that suggested his victim count might be significantly higher than the confirmed cases and demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication that deeply concerned law enforcement officials who studied his methods. Born on January 7, 1978, in Richmond, Utah, Keyes grew up in a deeply religious family that adhered to the Christian identity movement, a racist anti-government ideology that created in young Israel a distrust of authority and a sense of separateness from mainstream society that would later manifest in his criminal career. The family moved frequently during Keyes' childhood, living in various locations including Washington State and finally settling in a remote cabin near Colville, Washington, where they lived without electricity or running water, homeschooling their children and maintaining minimal contact with the outside world. This isolated upbringing created in Keyes a self-sufficient, wilderness-savvy mindset that he would later employ in his crimes, combined with an apparent inability to form normal emotional connections that manifested in cruelty to animals during his youth and an early fascination with death and violence. At age 14, Keyes began distancing himself from his family's religious extremism, though he retained their distrust of government and their survivalist mentality, skills that would prove instrumental in his ability to evade detection for over a decade of criminal activity. After serving in the United States Army from 1998 to 2001, where he received training in combat and survival skills, Keyes moved to Alaska and began working as a construction contractor, outwardly living a conventional life with a girlfriend and daughter while secretly planning and executing a series of murders that demonstrated unprecedented criminal methodology. Unlike most serial killers who operate in familiar geographic areas, Keyes deliberately chose to kill in locations he had no personal connection to, believing this would make it nearly impossible for investigators to link the crimes or identify him as a suspect. His method involved extensive planning. He would select a general geographic area, often based on construction jobs that took him to different parts of the country, then conduct reconnaissance trips to identify suitable locations for killing and body disposal. During these reconnaissance trips, Keyes would bury kill kits containing weapons, usually guns and knives, along with restraints, cash, and items for body disposal, caching these supplies in remote locations marked only in his memory or in coded notes, planning to return months or even years later to use them for murders. What distinguished Keyes's behavior was his compulsive need to return to these cache sites even when he wasn't actively planning to kill, checking on the buried kits to ensure they remained undiscovered and apparently deriving satisfaction from knowing these instruments of death were waiting for him across the country. Between approximately 2001 and his capture in 2012, Keyes killed at least 3 people and likely many more, though he remained vague about exact numbers in interviews with investigators, alternately claiming as many as 11 victims while refusing to provide details that would allow confirmation. His confirmed victims include Bill and Lorraine Currier, a married couple from Essex, Vermont, whom Keyes abducted from their home in June 2011, murdered in an abandoned house, and disposed of in a location that has never been discovered despite extensive searches based on Keyes's general descriptions of the area. The Currier case demonstrated Keyes's methodology. He had traveled to Vermont months earlier on a reconnaissance trip, identified the Currier's home as a suitable target based on its isolation and the couple's predictable routine, and returned in June 2011 specifically to kill them, bringing tools from one of his cached kill kits. After the murders, Keyes returned to the general area of where he had disposed of the bodies on at least 2 subsequent occasions, apparently to ensure the remains stayed hidden and to relive the crime through visiting the location. His final and most famous victim was 18-year-old Samantha Koenig, a barista in Anchorage, Alaska, whom Keyes abducted from her workplace on February 1, 2012, held captive in a shed on his property, raped and murdered, then kept her body frozen in the shed for approximately 2 weeks while he went on a previously planned cruise with his family, creating an almost surreal disconnect between his public life and his criminal activities. After returning from the cruise, Keyes removed Koenig's body from the shed, applied makeup to simulate life, positioned her corpse, and took photographs with that day's newspaper to create the illusion she was still alive, then used these photographs as part of a ransom scheme to extort money from her family. The location where Keyes disposed of Koenig's body, in Matanuska Lake, would become crucial to his capture. He had chosen the site specifically because he had visited it many times before and knew the area well, demonstrating his pattern of using familiar locations for body disposal even when committing crimes in his home area. Keyes's downfall came through his use of Samantha Koenig's debit card. In the weeks after her murder, he traveled through the southwestern United States, withdrawing money from her account at ATMs in multiple states, believing that the geographic spread and time delay would prevent investigators from connecting these transactions to her disappearance. However, bank surveillance cameras captured his image, and facial recognition technology combined with vehicle identification led Texas state troopers to pull Keyes over on March 13, 2012, discovering Koenig's debit card in his possession and arresting him for fraud and murder. During the months-long interrogation that followed, conducted by FBI agents who recognized they had captured an unprecedented type of serial offender, Keyes provided limited information about his crimes, offering details about the Koenig and Currier murders while hinting at additional victims in Washington State, New York, and other locations. His descriptions of his modus operandi included extensive discussion of his practice of burying kill kits and returning to these cache sites, explaining that he had established caches across the United States from Alaska to Vermont, some of which he had never used but maintained for potential future crimes. Investigators found this pattern of cache placement and revisitation particularly disturbing because it suggested Keyes had been planning murders years in advance and maintaining a national network of hidden weapons and tools, representing a level of premeditation and geographic scope unprecedented in serial murder cases. Keyes also described returning to areas where he had committed crimes, not necessarily to the exact disposal sites but to the general regions, taking drives through areas where he had killed victims and apparently deriving satisfaction from being in proximity to his crimes while remaining undetected. He explained to interrogators that these returns served multiple purposes. They allowed him to ensure bodies remained undiscovered. They provided opportunities to relive the crimes through environmental cues and memory, and they satisfied his compulsive need to maintain control over every aspect of his criminal activities. FBI agent Jeff Bell, who conducted many of the interrogation sessions with Keyes, later described his behavior as representing a new category of serial offender: highly mobile, methodical, with no victim preference or geographic pattern, making detection through traditional profiling nearly impossible. The case became even more complex when Keyes began revealing information about kills in other states, providing just enough detail to suggest he was telling the truth, but withholding crucial information like victim names or exact disposal locations, apparently using these revelations as bargaining chips for better conditions or simply to maintain control over the investigation. He admitted to burying at least a dozen kill kits across the United States, providing locations for some but not all, leading to recovery operations that uncovered weapons and supplies in remote locations in Alaska, New York, Texas, and other states, confirming his descriptions but raising disturbing questions about how many additional caches remained undiscovered and what he had planned to do with them. The investigation also revealed that Keyes had returned to some cache sites multiple times over years, in some cases retrieving items, in others simply checking on the caches, and in at least one instance apparently deciding a location was no longer suitable and relocating the entire kit to a new hiding place, demonstrating an ongoing engagement with his criminal infrastructure even during periods when he wasn't actively killing. On December 2, 2012, while awaiting trial in an Anchorage jail, Israel Keyes committed suicide by cutting his wrists and hanging himself with bedsheets, leaving behind a 4-page suicide note consisting primarily of a rambling poem, but providing no additional information about potential victims or cache locations, frustrating investigators who had hoped to eventually extract complete confessions and locate additional victims. His death effectively ended the investigation into his full scope of crimes, leaving numerous questions unanswered. How many people did he actually kill? Where are the bodies of the courier couple and potentially other victims? How many kill kits remain buried across the United States? Were there additional victims beyond those he hinted at in interrogations? The FBI subsequently released selected portions of Keyes' interrogation recordings and requested public assistance in identifying potential victims based on his travel patterns, generating thousands of tips but few confirmed connections to unsolved cases. The psychological analysis of Keyes' behavior, particularly his compulsive establishment and revisitation of cache sites and his returns to general crime areas, revealed a unique criminal psychology combining elements of predatory planning, survivalist mentality, narcissistic control needs, and paraphilic arousal from the planning and execution of perfect crimes. Dr. Wade Myers, a forensic psychiatrist who reviewed the case, suggested that Keyes' pattern of cache placement and revisitation represented a form of extended fantasy play in which the planning and preparation for murders provided almost as much satisfaction as the killings themselves, creating a continuous cycle of anticipation, action, and reliving that sustained his criminal career for over a decade. The Israel Keyes case has fundamentally changed how law enforcement approaches serial murder investigations, highlighting the challenges posed by highly mobile offenders who deliberately avoid victim selection patterns and geographic clustering, and emphasizing the importance of national databases and interagency cooperation in identifying and tracking such criminals. The discovery that Keyes had been systematically creating a national infrastructure for murder, complete with prepositioned weapons and supplies that he would return to check on and eventually use, represented a level of premeditation that deeply concerned criminal justice professionals and led to increased focus on connecting seemingly random crimes across jurisdictions through behavioral analysis and forensic evidence sharing. Today, the Keyes case remains partially solved, with his confirmed victims numbering only 3 but strong evidence suggesting additional victims whose identities and locations may never be discovered, and with unknown numbers of his kill kits potentially still buried in remote locations across the United States, waiting to be discovered by hikers or hunters and providing eerie proof of the elaborate criminal infrastructure he created and compulsively maintained through his returns to cache sites and crime areas, a chilling reminder that some serial killers bring unprecedented levels of planning and sophistication to their crimes, making them extraordinarily difficult to detect and leaving mysteries that may never be fully solved even after the perpetrator's death.